The political history of the Hellenic world is, in some sense, a history of a series of revolutions that completely changed the social fabric and the moral fabric of ancient Greek society. Today, we're going to talk about an ancient Greek who lived through a tumultuous time during that period of revolutions, the 6th and 5th centuries BC. That is Theognis of Megara. And our main source for discussing this individual is going to be Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote his dissertation at Schulpforta on the topic of Theognis of Megara, and obviously at this time in his life he was pursuing a career in classical philology, and so this dissertation is a philological work rather than a philosophical one. In this work, the issues of interest to Nietzsche are the task of constructing a timeline of Theognis' life and determining where his fragmentary poems belong on that timeline. Because, after all, there is some question as to when his poems were written, or even which ones came from Theognis' own hand and which were added later or appended to his work. Nietzsche draws on the work of past philologists to answer these questions, and he sometimes agrees and sometimes disagrees with their conclusions, but overall, Nietzsche's project is to wage war against the ubiquitous idea that Theognis was a gnomic poet, meaning a poet whose work was intended as a series of ethical maxims. Poetic gnomes is the somewhat archaic term, but it means short, compact verses meant to be used as moral teachings. Theognis of Megara had long been regarded this way as a teacher of ethics through poetry, even within the ancient world. Authors out of antiquity describe Theognis as, a strict moralist and craft this image of him that sort of accords with that picture. And this was influenced by the fact that in school, in the ancient world, men of learning were brought up to learn many of the verses of the Theognidaea by heart. And therefore, as his work was presented as moral teachings and used for the purposes of imprinting a moral teaching, which is something Nietzsche argues that Theognis himself never intended, this picture emerged of him in the historical record that is, according to Nietzsche, completely false, and misrepresented not only who he was, but what the nature of his work was. Nietzsche argues rather convincingly that a moral instruction, in the narrow sense of morality that we typically mean by that word today, could not have been farther from the mind of Theognis when he wrote his poems. They were not intended to be moral teachings, and in order to portray them as such, interpreters of all ages had to ignore, for example, Theognis' drinking songs and convivial poems which celebrate the joys of youth and the pleasure of leisure, the pleasure afforded by a noble life. These are not usually topics we'd associate with a strict moralist, and so these particular lines of the Theognidaea tended to be conveniently forgotten. But what Nietzsche shows in his essay is that, in fact, the inclusion of these topics within his poems make perfect sense if we instead understand the true nature of Theognis' poetry, and that he wrote poetry as most poets do, to express his inner feelings and passions. That he wrote poetry throughout his life, from when he was a young man, through his time of exile from his home city of Megara, and later when he was in old age. His poems express a variety of feelings, dreams, regrets, and so on. And finally, Nietzsche argues that the content of his poems can indicate to us a sort of story of Theognis' life, in which he is born as a wealthy noble in Megara. He faced a period of democratic revolutions there, in which his family was exiled, along with the other members of the aristocracy who opposed the popular party. He spent time in other city-states away from his homeland, where he grew to nurture a hatred for the plebeians and the democratic movements generally. And finally, he returned to Megara after the aristocrats overthrew the new government in a war of, reaction. But the city would, of course, never be the same again. That's the story of Theognis' life as Nietzsche tells it, and in his view, it's the key to understanding his poems. And so we see from the beginning how in his very project we get the broad strokes of Nietzsche's project in philosophy, albeit dating from a pre-philosophical era of his work, Nietzsche is eternally at war with moral interpretations of eras, figures, or movements in history. He sees a figure like Theognis not as a Socratic instructor of virtue through philosophical teaching, right, but as a figure who lives, who expresses his passions, who sometimes expresses things which we might consider to be less than admirable, especially by our modern moral standards, and who's a representative of his social class, right? He's the representative of the aristocratic caste, and he's an advocate for the order of rank, the pathos of distance, all these aristocratic precepts that Nietzsche ultimately finds influence for his political philosophy in. And so Nietzsche, rather than seeing Theognis in part of this moralist tradition, right, where we might include, we could say he's like sort of proto-Socratic, right? We would include the Socratic tradition. And of course, over time, this intertwines or morphs into sort of the Christian world interpretation, right? Instead, Nietzsche sees Theognis standing for the Dionysian, or actually more properly the Apollonian, or perhaps both, right? The Dionysian in sort of the fuller sense of the term Dionysian that Nietzsche would later use in his, sort of final works, like around the time of Twilight of Idols. But around this time in his life, or actually even a little bit after this time, because this is very, very early Nietzsche, this is Nietzsche's, dissertation as a very young man. But the term Apollonian, the way he uses it in Birth of Tragedy, both of those terms, or whichever one you want to pick, they elucidate something about Theognis. They throw light onto different aspects of his character as Nietzsche interprets him. He's a man of the Greek master morality, right? This is a man he feels he has the good within him, and that which is good sort of flows out of the essence of who he is, right? And men who are bonded together by the same common feeling, right, of their aristocratic power. These are the people who would call themselves, as Nietzsche would later write, the beautiful, the good, the happy. Theognis doesn't feel that he has to justify or give reasons for his nobility. He feels, in fact, that the democratic tendency in Greek society is nothing but a threat to all that is good and sacred. And so, it's someone who represents the Greek pre-Christian morality par excellence, really, who acknowledges the necessary inequality that is always part of life and proudly stands in favor of it, right? Theognis affirms the superstition and the ritual that gave the aristocrats their power. He's an advocate for the Greek enchantment of the world given by the old religion and the social system which was established by this. In Theognis' lifetime, he saw this revolution, a political revolution, yes, but also a revolution in morality, which threatened and ultimately destroyed that social system. Since, as we mentioned, even when the aristocrats returned to Megara, society had been reshaped by various things, by the wealth, right, that had allowed the plebeians to sort of advance into a level of financial power that they'd never had before. And, the dissolution of these clear boundaries that it had once existed between the classes, all that is mostly gone, at least as Theognis sees it. And so he became rather bitter, hateful even. And Nietzsche interprets Theognis' work as sort of a cultural war against democracy and egalitarianism. That emerges within Theognis' poems, many of which are written for Cyrnus, a younger man whom Theognis took on as his mentor and hoped that one day would take, Theognis' teachings and sort of lead a movement against the democratic values. That was Theognis' hope for the young Cyrnus, but Nietzsche is careful to, emphasize that this is not a course of moral instruction to make him a better member of the herd, but a sort of exaltation to fight against the underlying ideas, the underlying values of moralism itself. Speaking here of morality as anti-life, morality as condemnation of things such as the natural inequality of life, the condemnation of that, the inclination to wish to correct life, to bring it into alignment with all of our oughts, right? This kind of moralistic thinking is quite the opposite of the Theognidean teaching, according to Nietzsche. And so in the very beginning of Nietzsche's canon, we already find the basis of Nietzsche's later ideas in terms of his political orientation. Before we go further, I want to stress something which may not be entirely obvious to modern audiences, but which would have been understood by people of antiquity as indicated by the term poet. Theognis's elegies were meant to be recited to music, to the rhythm of a flute. Theognis was not so much a poet in the modern sense of the term, but a lyricist, a musical composer, right? Poetry in those days always had a musical element, which is relatively unknown with modern poetic recitation, right? You think of a poetry reading, there's no music accompanying it. That would even seem weird to most people. Now, obviously, lyricism in modern music is sort of, you could say that's a form of musical poetry that exists today, since most of our popular music is lyrical. But even as different as our modern music is from what the Greeks had, a musical performance is probably closer to what a Theognidean elegy was like rather than a poetry reading, right? His poems are supposed to be musical. They're meant to be performed at the symposia. Okay, so first, let's sort of look at, a rough sketch of Theognis's life. Our source for this and for the whole episode will be Nietzsche's Dissertation, and in addition to this, a fragment from 1864 entitled Studies in Theognis, which is only a few pages long, but it seems to be a great resource since it provides a good summary of the broad ideas signified by Theognis in his life and work, like in contrast with the Dissertation, which is, it's like De Theognidea Megarantia, I believe is what it is, which you can translate as On Theognis of Megara. The Dissertation is heavy with primary sources and citations from other philologists, whereas this fragment in the same year that he writes, or maybe it was a couple of years later, but it's around the same time, it's much more sort of the bullet points, right? And as a final note, before we continue, Nietzsche would have been 20 years old when he graduated Schulpforta, which means this is the work of a very young Nietzsche, more a student than a master, right? Although his meteoric rise to becoming a notable academic was not long after this, right? He was already sort of impressive to his mentors. We should also note that in order to submit his dissertation, Nietzsche had to translate it into Latin, showing us, of course, the command of the ancient languages that was demanded if one wanted to join the ranks of classical philologists. Nietzsche wrote to his friend Wilhelm Pender, quote, "This morning I have begun my work on Theognis. 5 pages are ready. The Latinitas is painful. I have already laughed a few times this morning over many short queries." End quote. Nietzsche translated 7 pages by Monday, 16 the next day, 27 the day after, and finished it completely by that Thursday. In retrospect, Nietzsche would say that he found the dissertation, quote, linguistically awkward, and in a letter to Karl von Gersdorff 3 years later, in 1867, he said that he wrote dryly and with a logical corset. In fact, we see a hint of Nietzsche's general disdain for the tendency towards over-specialization in academia and the increasing sort of triviality and procedural aspects of academia. He writes, quote, "For we would not deny that most philologists lack that elevating total view of antiquity, because they stand too close to the picture and investigate a patch of paint instead of gazing at the big, bold brushstrokes of the whole painting, and what is more, enjoying them." End quote. So in his comments on the dissertation, we have like a paradigmatic Nietzschean attack on the scholars, right? Written even at a time when Nietzsche himself was still very much an academic. But it reminds me of the later words in his Untimely Meditations, the period of cultural criticism in which this type of critique on academia is made very explicit, right? That the education provided by modern academic institutions is not an education of the whole picture, as he calls it here. It's not taught by those who can actually comprehend the whole picture or even inhabit the perspective of the ancients or take joy in the things that the ancients did. It's an education of technique and specialization and minutiae, an education that never touches real life and its struggles or the deep concerns of values and the competition between values, right? Both in the individual and society at large, but simply, teaches you how to work away at one little nook, digging in one little shaft, expanding one's mental acuity for the purposes of solving problems within a limited sphere of attention. And so Nietzsche's already something of a rebel in the philology department. He says some things that might lead us to think that Nietzsche was already sort of practicing philology in a more expansive way, and perhaps in an almost philosophical way when he's writing the dissertation. In a letter to Pinder and Gustav Krug, another friend, this is June of 1864, he says, quote, "I am writing a major work on Theognis by my own choice. I have allowed myself again to be involved in a number of suppositions and fantasies, but I intend to complete this work with the right philological grounding and in the most scientific way possible. I have now gained a new point of view concerning the study of this man, and on many respects I judge him differently than the current opinion. I have thoroughly examined the best studies that exist on the topic." End quote. So we can see this balancing act of the two competing values that Nietzsche wishes to entertain while, writing this major work, as he calls it, which, it should be noted, was actually not undertaken by his own choice, as he says. He was assigned the topic. But that fact aside, we can say definitively that he took to the task of presenting a coherent interpretation of the life and work of Theognis with zeal, right? But there's this ambivalence that we see between the desire to present the work as scientifically as possible, with, in line with the scientific analytic approach to philology, Sprachphilology, as that would have been called, and Nietzsche's desire to entertain suppositions and fantasies, to grasp the broad strokes of the picture, right? To attempt to inhabit the perspective of Theognis. What might be called, in a broad sense, Sachphilology, a non-scientific hermeneutical approach to the discipline. Or, if you'd like, Zukunftsphilology, future philology, the portmanteau that Wilhelmowitz Moellendorff applied to Nietzsche's first book, Birth of Tragedy, years later, and he meant it as a sort of insult, right? Wagner, the composer, and Nietzsche's cultural and philosophical mentor, had indicated that his music was a sort of cultural emanation from the future, that he was making music from the future. And so Nietzsche's critics charged that he was practicing a new form of philology, from the future as well, right? As a sort of dig at Nietzsche for being a Wagnerian. That he was letting his Wagnerianism overtake the scientific commitments demanded by classical philology. But anyway, as we all know, Nietzsche would embrace this aesthetic with the idea that he was writing to philosophers of the future, right? And in some sense, his philological work represents the same spirit of trying to transcend the rigor and the procedure of the scientific demands of the discipline and aim for something which truly speaks to the soul or to the psyche of man. Something that educates you in the deep sense that he's looking for. And so Nietzsche, even long after he broke with Wagner and stopped even considering himself a classical philologist, was still embraced this idea that his thought was a rejection of the present values, and always claimed it was a hope for different values to arise in the future. And so Antimo Negri suggests that Nietzsche's philology of the future was first expressed in this essay on Theognis, in this dissertation, and that the spirit behind this project is commensurate with the spirit behind his later philosophical project, that there's a smooth transition there, right? And we've sort of made that case before, albeit in a different way on the podcast. And so now we'll finally get into the work itself, and let Nietzsche lead us on in this exploration of the life of Theognis. Nietzsche writes in the first section of the dissertation, after the introductory outline that he gives, quote, "In the city of Megara, as in almost every city of the Dorians, the supreme authority in the administration of rights was controlled by the nobility, who, since ancient times, confined the common inhabitants to living in bordering territories, remote from the capital city, and struck by poverty and ignorance. But gradually, when commerce with the colonies founded in fertile regions flourished, from which riches and luxuries flowed back to the mother city, dissensions arose between the optimates and the plebeians. Hence it happened that Theagenes, seconded by the masses, whose favor he had attracted, seized public authority using a cunning procedure similar to that of almost all tyrants. End quote. And at the end, he cites Aristotle to back up his accounting of Theognis' ascent to tyranny. So what we have here, Megara, a city-state of the Dorians. Remember, the most famous city-state of the Dorians is Sparta, and Nietzsche considers the Doric civilization a perpetual outpost of Apollonian culture in Greece. This is what he writes in Birth of Tragedy. Never overwhelmed by the Dionysian art. Remember, the Dionysian is the art force that dissolves barriers, right? The Dorians are a rigidly hierarchical people with, regularity of line and form in their art. They're Apollonians, meaning they hold above all things the shining Olympian hero of a noble bearing. And Apollo is the god who fires his bow from a distance, signifying in some sense distance and boundaries. You might remember also from what we covered with the ancient city in Fustel de Coulanges' work, the sacred religious nature of these boundaries between men and these boundaries between lands, right? Again, Nietzsche mentions how the nobility lived within the city and kept the common folk out of it. And of course, that would be the case because the city was founded as a holy site originally and was only for those who shared the common worship, those qualified to be priests, which were only the aristocracy. And then there is a democratic agitation, that there's this disturbance and dissolution of these social differences. But Nietzsche sort of attributes that to wealth and what the ancients would have called, or what they would have said in ancient Rome, luxuria, right? And after this, a tyrant comes in. That's Theognis. We actually mentioned him. Coulanges recorded how this was the typical pattern during the revolutions beginning around the 6th century BC. But if you remember, Coulanges discusses how Theognis ambushed the nobility of the city and their herds and, killed them and appropriated their wealth, right? But it's interesting because Nietzsche, Coulanges is emphasizing the changing beliefs of mankind and sort of presents it almost, I wouldn't quite say in a Hegelian way, but almost in because it's not very dialectical, but Coulanges seems to think men's minds were sort of struggling towards a more truthful or a fuller or more accurate picture of the world, and that the ancient beliefs were sort of absurd, and that as our minds sort of evolved, you might say, we were able to shed those beliefs and new beliefs and social circumstances took hold and new values. Nietzsche also emphasizes the material conditions here, which is interesting. And he's, because he's sort of attributing wealth and luxury as the force that destabilized the Greek city-states and the old social order. And we'll see this attitude being very much opposed to wealth and to free trade and the accumulation of property being open to just anyone, right? For one, it's not an uncommon view in the ancient world, but Nietzsche is also right there along with them. He thinks it's a socially disintegrative force, and ultimately it will destroy the hierarchy in which the cultures are founded. And so Nietzsche establishes the history. We had a ruling aristocracy, and they become dominated by a tyrant, right? The city of Megara eventually expels the tyrant Theognis, but the popular party that, he drew his support from the populares, they remain in power. And as Plutarch writes, quote, "Once the Megarians expelled the tyrant Theognis, they were judicious for some time with respect to the administration of government. Then, when demagogues offered them the nectar of an excessive and immoderate freedom, they became extremely corrupt and began attacking the rich shamelessly and breaking into their houses. The poor claimed a right to feast and drink sumptuously, and if they could not get away with it, they violently and abusively grabbed everything." End quote. So the supposedly democratic government degenerated into what the ancients sometimes called holocracy or ochlocracy, mob rule, in which manipulative leaders basically grift large numbers of people for their own benefit or else, simply conspire to use the absolute power of the state purely for personal gain. And the state was rather absolutely powerful during this time. And democracy itself dies by its own hand because this is so socially disruptive to the city life. Nietzsche quotes from Aristotle in his work Politics, Part 5, quote, "And in like manner democracy was abolished in Megara. For the demagogues, to be able to confiscate property, expelled many of the notables, thus creating many fugitives." End quote. Theognis was one of those fugitives who left the city during this time. He lived in various cities and colonies, sometimes welcomed by the nobility of other lands, who were sympathetic to the plight of the Megarian aristocracy. Theognis' writing during this time uses a great deal of metaphors involving ships and sea travel because this was the reality of his life. And Nietzsche quite beautifully says that for Theognis, poetry was the safe port in which his soul, like a wayward ship, could find refuge. Nietzsche examines some of the verses of Theognis and compares them to the historical record, as we have it from the ancient historians. Theognis writes of, quote, "prophets that come with public disgrace," end quote. He writes that, quote, "they seize property by force and order has perished," end quote. Or in verses 41 through 42, he says that his fellow countrymen, quote, "are still sensible, but their leaders have changed," end quote, and have made them, quote, "fall into deep evil," end quote. This recalls Plutarch's allegation that the democratic leaders, having taken power from Theognis, were at first judicious, but they were won over by the promises of demagogues. For Theognis' part, he claims in his poetry not to be disturbed by the relative state of poverty that he now had to endure, or the character attacks against him and the other aristocrats from the Democratic Party. But in actual fact, he would lament both of these things quite a bit throughout his poetic canon, writing numerous verses against false friends or those who betrayed their friends, and speaking of poverty as one of the worst things imaginable. But we should perhaps say that in the following verses, we could interpret his words as representing the idea that it's not strictly the material deprivation of poverty that he finds lamentable. Rather, it's the situation that is unfolding as he finds that his youth is fading, right? Theognis perceives that he now must become a vagrant when he's past the age of 30, rather than being able to remain at his home, at peace in an orderly society. He has to endure exile. So here are lines 1129 through 1132, quote, "Heartbreaking poverty does not bother me, or hostile men who speak evil of me, but I am grieved over my beloved youth slipping away, and weep at the imminence of a dreadful old age," end quote. Nietzsche's interpretation of this section of lines we find in the preceding paragraph of the Dissertation, from where he quotes from these lines. Nietzsche writes, quote, "Theognis undoubtedly was among the exiled aristocrats, since before his exile he fought bitterly against the popular party and its political institutions. He himself recalls that at that time his youth was slipping away and he was haunted by poverty and the insult of slanderers," end quote. In any case, Theognis seems to have initially pretended to have sympathies with the populists, sort of when the democratizing revolution of the city first began. Nietzsche believes that Theognis strove to ingratiate himself with the people, but that this act of his was sort of seen through by the common people very quickly, or by the politicians for the popular party. Nietzsche writes that, quote, "He deceived himself, since his adversaries, who perceived that his love of nobility was hardly hidden by an apparently popular spirit, seized his property and put his life in the greatest jeopardy," end quote. Theognis' verses accordingly read, and this is 831 to 32, quote, "By trusting, I lost my possessions, and by distrusting, I kept them. But being aware of both makes one bitter," end quote. To quote Nietzsche again of the verses I've just read just now. He says, quote, "It seems then that these verses were composed at the beginning of that conflict when, defeated and deprived of his property, he left and went into exile." End quote. So during that time, Theognis visited Sicily, Euboea, Sparta, and oftentimes Theognis and other exiled aristocrats found that they were relatively well treated, because after all, the Dorian civilization was friendly to oligarchies or aristocracies and relatively unfriendly to the concept of democracy, and so they often wished to help the nobility of foreign cities that had been exiled. But Theognis and his kin were now people without a homeland, right? They were refugees relying on the charity of other aristocrats. Or, perhaps they would receive help out of a sort of sacred duty that the other aristocrats felt they had towards them. But you're still depending on the goodwill of others, right? Which means you're no longer that independent, self-sufficient, wealthy noble that you once were. Nietzsche writes, and here I quote in abridged form from the Dissertation, quote, "Theognis decided to flee, and at first hesitated at whether he should take his wife Argyris with him, should I understand correctly, and proposed the same to the adolescent Cyrnus, whom he loved with fatherly affection. He lived for a long time in Sicily and was honored with citizenship of Megara Hyblaea. He himself acknowledges that he tolerated his exile in Sicily moderately well, and if anyone wonders what his condition was, he bids to say in verse 520, 'Well, but with difficulty, though not well.' The misfortune of exile seems diminished, especially by the fact that the aristocrats in exile always endeavored to return to their homeland and regain their former status. It seems that Theognis left Sicily by ship and arrived in Euboea, an island whose nobles, holders of opulence and luxury, welcomed the exiled in a magnificent and splendid manner. He spent the last part of his exile in Sparta at the seat of the nobility, where the exiles hoped that they would likely receive help against their hostile fellow citizens. It does not seem credible that these exiles would invade their homeland with their own military force without the help of others, or would vanquish the popular party and regain control of their government." End quote. And so I think to step back here for a minute and consider what we might think of Theognis, it's very tempting for those of us with modern morality to treat the plight of Theognis at this point in his life with derision and as something which is only well-deserved by those who might have suffered it, right? That, of course, the material interests of the upper class are not served by class warfare, obviously, and the unequal distribution of property and wealth was now being democratized, just as the political power was being democratized. And so, of course, the upper class would oppose this and characterize it as anarchy, dissolution, destruction of all order, and all that's sacred. But in reality, perhaps it is simply their reactionary attitude at the loss of their personal material interest to what is in actuality justice, right? From our modern perspective, this is economic justice and social justice, right? But I think what we should remember here is that whether this outlook on the situation, our modern outlook, whether it's wrong or right, we'd be imposing a framework for understanding this situation that's strictly materialist, and quite avowedly so. And while I did mention how Nietzsche brings in a sort of material analysis, to put it in purely material terms, I mean, that's sort of like the famously Marxist approach to studying history, right? And in purely material terms, we can understand this conflict only as a class struggle between a common folk seeking democratic representation versus an entrenched elite minority who's holding on to power that gives a small number the most wealth and privilege. But if we consider the situation from the lens of culture, or from a lens which is not strictly material, that is, if we wish not simply to pass judgment on the past, but to understand why the events unfolded the way they did, to the aristocracies of these cities, the plebeians were not even of the same society as them. Remember, in ancient Rome, the reconciliation between the patricians and plebs was drafted along the same lines as a treaty between two warring peoples, and they saw themselves as fundamentally not the same society, right? To the patricians, or in Greece, the eupatrids, the plebeians were not, they didn't share a culture, they didn't share a religion, they didn't share a society, the city didn't belong to them. These people didn't have any ancestors, they didn't have any sacred lands, they didn't have a right to demand anything. The aristocrats believed they were the only ones who could properly administer the rites and serve as intercessors with the gods, meaning that without them, and without the sacred worship that they maintained, their cities would be ruined and destroyed. Quite literally ruined and destroyed, right? The gods would withdraw their protection and visit their wrath upon them. And so democracy to them was not just a change in the political structure, but it was an attack on the world enchantment in which they lived. It was an attack on the values that said what was yours was what was religiously bound to you, right? The land in which your ancestors had been buried and the property which your family had accrued belonged not to any individual, but to a lineage that was divinely protected. And it was protected as such because it lived in service to these familial and domestic divinities. The plebeians were, they were impious. They had no lands. They had no ancestral tombs. And so to the aristocrats of the ancient cities, they were rightfully kept away from all that was sacred within the city. And so the expropriation of property to these aristocrats was a sort of horror that transcends the material interest and enters into the realm of a religious sacrilege of really of the most existential variety, right? And meanwhile, perhaps someone like Nietzsche would come in with the retrospective interpretation that the Megarian culture itself was founded upon these religious values, which established that basic inequality and difference between noble and common, and that the destruction of this mental framework for understanding oneself and your place in the world would ultimately, that destruction would have to come with this democratic revolution, that the culture itself would die, and that all that was valuable about the Greeks and the Dorians would be lost, because the state would come into the hands of those for whom material interests are all that matter, right? They have no religion. They don't have these beliefs. So material interests are all that matter, which means gain short-term advantage, right? Fulfill the immediate impulses. The kind of perspective that one has when they see themselves not as an individual, but as like the steward of a lineage, that perspective is impossible for the plebeians, right? They don't have responsibilities that go beyond their own lifespan. And so the state is therefore managed in this short-sighted manner. So, I don't know. Whatever we think of this, I think it's just worth fully elucidating where everyone is coming from in this sort of social conflict. But in any case, it seems the nobles eventually did retake the city, as we alluded to earlier, and perhaps with the help of the Spartans. Aristotle records, quote, "Those who returned overcame the people in a battle and established an oligarchy," end quote. In another section, where Aristotle is discussing who was eligible for voting on public affairs as a citizen, he writes, quote, "At Megara, only those who returned from exile and had fought jointly against the popular party were eligible," end quote. And so Theognis returned to the city of Megara, a much older man, where he lived for some time, and he reached the age of 90, according to Nietzsche's assessment. And contrary to popular myth, right? Well, while it was as rare as it is now, and perhaps a good deal rarer because many more opportunities for death existed back then, nevertheless, living to the age of 90 was not that outlandish or unheard of, and it does fit with the dates given, so it is quite possible that Theognis lived to be that old. But the city was different now, as we've mentioned. It had changed during the time of his exile because once that old religious morality of the aristocracy was gone, and the class distinctions were completely blurred by wealth flowing into the plebeian households and being taken out of formerly aristocratic households, and once the institutions of state had proven useful in serving one's personal gain, right? And the state was able to act independently of the divine or the dictates of the divine. Well, the cat's out of the bag at that point, right? Megara is irrevocably changed. As Fustel de Coulanges argued, once the series of revolutions began to alter the underlying religious assumptions, the social structure that was based upon those assumptions could not survive. Nietzsche writes that Theognis now saw, quote, plebeian owners enjoying themselves, while honors were granted to men who had previously been banned from government, and furthermore that noble blood was being defiled by marriages with new men, having voluntarily yielded to the winning faction the right to intermarriage, end quote. So this is a very important point that we also, I guess we've tangentially discussed so far in this season, but insofar as this is a kind of genetic politics that is somewhat unknown in the modern world, right? When we see racism in the modern world, for example, it's usually people who have ideas about whole ethnicities of people as being fundamentally different or inferior in some way from others. Whereas here Nietzsche sees Theognis' concern as a mixing not of races, but of classes, of the nobility having been established as being totally different in essence than the lower class by the religious beliefs on which their society was based. Now they're intermingling with rich plebeians, people who have no ancestry. In the past ages, right, a father marrying off his daughter to a plebeian would not only be inconceivable, but, if he were to entertain the notion at all, he'd probably consider it like cruel. He'd be like handing her over to a barbarian, basically, right? A house with no gods, no divine protection from this cruel world of spirits and forces and deities that surround mankind. She'd be exiled from her family and from her domestic religion, but she'd find no new one to offer her a new identity. And that's why intermarriage between classes was regarded as untenable by these ancient societies for so long. But once these revolutions begin in rapid succession, those religious values begin to fall by the wayside, and that happens very, very quickly. And part of it might be that the nobility themselves were perhaps not as noble as Theognis might have hoped they were. Not all of them were willing to endure poverty and privation, and may have simply found that, if their class position started to slip a little bit and they were in danger of not enjoying the kind of wealth that they were used to having, either by just ill circumstances or by having their wealth expropriated or whatever, marrying a rich plebeian is a perfectly acceptable way, at that point to regain the luxury that you're accustomed to. So Theognis, therefore, has nothing but contempt for the nobles who didn't stick to the class distinctions as they were originally drawn, the people who compromised, right? The weak nobles who gave in to the revolt of the plebs. He hates them almost as much as he does the masses, who he sees in a typical fashion among the ancient Greeks as being, in their very essence, false people, those who do not hold true to their word, right? They don't have any bonds of loyalty or sacred oaths to regulate their behavior. They're untrustworthy and out only for themselves. Theognis' comments on the falseness of the common people are, in fact, used by Nietzsche in one of the only references to Theognis in his published philosophical canon, in Genealogy of Morality. In fact, we'll divert to what Nietzsche says in that part of the work very briefly because this episode's all about Theognis, so while his dissertation is our main source, it's worth looking at this bit of analysis and how it factors into Nietzsche's entire interpretation of the moral outlook of Greek aristocracies. Theognis is central to how Nietzsche came to understand that, right? And so this is from Genealogy, section 5, first essay. Quote, they, the nobility, call themselves, for instance, the truthful. This is so, above all, of the Greek nobility, whose mouthpiece is the Megarian poet Theognis. The root of the word coined for this esthlos signifies one who is, who possesses reality, who is actual, who is true. Then, with a subjective turn, the true as the truthful. In this phase of conceptual transformation, it becomes a slogan and catchword of the nobility and passes over entirely into the sense of noble, as distinct from the lying common man, which is what Theognis takes him to be and how he describes him, until finally, after the decline of the nobility, the word is left to designate nobility of soul and becomes, as it were, ripe and sweet." End quote. So Nietzsche's stand-in the genealogy to speak for the position of the ancient Greek aristocracy is Theognis. And that position is that the people who are trustworthy, who were true, who truly possessed a being, right? Who truly were, meaning that they had substance, they had action to back up their words. Their words are not simply empty or hollow or meant to mislead, right? Their words actually indicated the substance of who they were. And so being true in the sense of following through on your promises and oaths and obligations, later this gives way to the idea of the nobility of the soul, right? Associated with honesty and trustworthiness as a sort of moral duty, right? But originally, this was seen as a trait of the upper class, something literally inherited, right? Or at best, inculcated by an education into the ranks of the aristocrats. Something, that grows when you are in an environment that's protected and sort of in the walled-off environment of the aristocratic city, separate from the depravity and the untruthfulness of the common people. Because as we remember, the inclination to deception as a survival strategy, as Nietzsche points out in On Truth and Lies in the extramoral sense, deception is adopted by those who lack the physical force to overcome opposition because they've been denied the ability to wage war with fangs and sharp teeth, as he says. We might therefore consider the lines 27 and 28, where Theognis says that his own ethical instruction, which he transmitted to Cyrnus, was simply his own aristocratic upbringing, something inherited as a child. Quote, "Such things as I myself, Cyrnus, learned from good men while still a child." End quote. Or we might also look conversely at verses 305 through 307, in which Theognis says, quote, "The bad people were not completely bad from childhood, but after befriending other bad men, they have also learned wrongdoing, abusive language, and excess." End quote. And so Theognis writes in his poetry that doing good to the plebeians, to the bad, common, low-born people, doing anything charitable or kind to them, is, quote, "a most useless kindness. It is like sowing the white furrows of the sea, because neither sowing the sea will yield a rich harvest, nor by doing good to the bad man would you receive any good in return." End quote. That last line, "nor by doing good to the bad man," you could say commoner. It would be the word kakus is used here, which basically means bad person. This is why we always have to clarify the meaning, because kakus means literally someone bad, but with the connotations of low or ill birth, of being craven or cowardly, or being common, base, vicious, and so on, right? This is, of course, one of Nietzsche's great etymological assertions in the genealogy of morality, that the term for bad person was one and the same with the term for a low-born person originally, and the same with the term for a good person, a noble person, and that in the original sense of these words, the ancient Greeks couldn't even make a conceptual distinction between those two ideas. And so Theognis writes verses such as lines 437 through 38, where he says, quote, "Only by teaching you will never turn a bad man into a good man." End quote. Theognis takes to heart the adage by Bias of Priene, that famous quote, "Most men are bad," and seems to represent this meaning in quite a literal way, according to the implications of birth included in the term bad, meaning most men are common, which from a numerical statistical sense, right, actually would be a sort of a truism. The good people are the stalwart nobility of the various city estates who maintain the city worship and take up arms and fight for the city when it's in danger. And they traditionally rule, therefore, as a sort of right and privilege of their rank. But that's always a minority of people. And so it's always a minority who deserve that power and freedom. This distinction between the good men, meant here as a synonym for the aristocratic class, It completely pervades the poetry of Theognis. It's perhaps his central focus, his affirmation of the value of the classes of people that had been established by the old social structure. This is what Theognis and Nietzsche's view wished to manifest in his poetry, a statement of the good of the old aristocratic order and a contempt for its destruction, and especially a contempt for its destroyers, right? And so his verses, they don't always take the form of rage against the popular parties, but might in some cases serve as a reminder of the basis of the old valuations in an attempt to wrest the moral or cultural authority from the zeitgeist and return it to the hands of the nobility. That's what Nietzsche alleges that Theognis wished he could sort of influence with his verses. Nietzsche writes in section 15 of his dissertation that the nobility, quote, held in the highest esteem the antiquity of lineage and illustrious origin, especially when this origin could be traced back to heroes and to the gods themselves as founders. In contrast, the plebeians who sprang from a useless and pernicious lineage was cloaked in obscurity, and his name was not celebrated beyond his lifespan. This is something Theognis expresses bitterly in a couplet, quote, some vehemently blame the good men, others praise them, but there is no memory of the bad men at all, end quote. And so all this, that term, bad man, again, meaning lowborn, it begins to take on a tinge of something transcending mere birth, insofar as Theognis almost implicitly begins to associate that term with the weak nobles who gave in to the popular revolutions. Those men are bad too because they show the weakness, the craven, the cowardly spirit of the plebeians, right? Even if they are of high birth, and therefore they sort of forsake the tenets and the duties of their domestic deities in order to lie and become more like the plebs, and so they cease to be good men. Accordingly, Theognis writes, quote, the good men, Cyrnus, have never destroyed a city. The bad men rejoice in committing outrages. They also destroy the people and use justice in favor of those who act unjustly, end quote. Further down, Theognis continues, quote, from this arise seditions and the slaughter of men, end quote. That's all to be expected, I suppose, because as Theognis explains in another set of verses, quote, it is natural for the bad man to consider justice as wicked, as he has no respect whatsoever for an eventual divine punishment, end quote. And so, in commentary to all this, or as commentary to all this, Nietzsche writes, quote, with these last words, the poet expresses that plebeians, not constrained by any religion, are not afraid of the gods. We should recall at this point an opinion common in Theognis' times, or more precisely, one that was transmitted from the most ancient times of the Greeks to the epoch of Theognis, that reveals how much dignity the nobles attributed to themselves. They believed that the gods entered into a formal agreement with men, by which it was determined that if the gods received from men honors and ritual sacrifices, they would be obliged to grant them goods and benefits, end quote. And so, again, from all the research I did, I cannot conclude that Nietzsche ever read De Coulanges, but it seems that conclusions are very similar. They both see the origin of the aristocratic belief in their it finds its origin in this belief of their direct connection with the gods as intercessors, and that this springs from a much, much earlier time in Greek history, which was not even fully understood in its origins by those of Theognis' time. That, in fact, the basis of their connection with the divine were beliefs that far predated the current ones, and which existed layered beneath a series of other newer beliefs as the polytheistic cults of Greece expanded and syncretized with one another. In any case, this overturning of the old social situation led Theognis to begin to reverse some of his older ideas contained in earlier verses. In his earlier verses, he praises the justice of the gods as necessarily placing the wealth within the hands of the good men and, consigning the bad common people to poverty. The aristocrats maintained the pact with the gods, after all, as they made the proper offerings according to the correct rites. They therefore were given prosperity, and that meant the current social arrangement was, in the strict sense, just to them, right? And accordingly, the commoners are treated with wrath, right? But towards the end of his life, after returning to Megara from exile, Theognis seems to have altered those beliefs somewhat. Nietzsche, for his part, says that Theognis could not help but begin to doubt the justice of the gods. Theognis writes, quote, "Dear Zeus, you amaze me. You certainly rule over all things, because honor and supreme power are yours. How then, son of Kronos, does your mind dare to hold the guilty and the just man in the same esteem?" End quote. Poverty is always treated by Theognis as perhaps one of the worst states to live in, but it's because he alleges that one who is poor is made worse. They are made base by poverty, right? They're made common, such that those of a noble birth who are taken out of a life of leisure and made to live in privation become less noble in their character. And so he writes, quote, "Wretched poverty, against my desire, you teach me perforce much that is shameful," end quote. And in another set of verses, quote, "For it is necessary to search upon the earth as well as on the wide surface of the sea to find rescue, Cyrnus, from painful poverty," end quote. And so now the plebs have had a taste of wealth, making them greedy for it, but meanwhile the patricians have had a taste of poverty, meaning they're no longer the purely aristocratic souls that they used to be. Now they have to contend with want and jealousy and resentment, meaning that they are less than what they were. Furthermore, it must be stressed that Theognis understands that the old social order was premised in some sense on the nobility as this sort of intercessor between man and God, as those who maintain the offerings and the sacrifices. Because Theognis, by all indications, actually believed in this old religion, we cannot say, therefore, that this observation of the aristocracy is requiring this religious prestige in order to hold sway over the minds of the common people. We can't say that this is disingenuous or Machiavellian in the common usage of the term. But nevertheless, we should note that writers like Fustel de Coulanges, millennia later, are merely echoing Theognis when they show how the social order of the Greeks was rooted in religious conviction. So it's during this period that Theognis begins to entertain the idea that, therefore, perhaps everyone is somewhat guilty from the divine perspective, that we are all wayward from the gods' demands of character and virtue, and everyone is touched by criminality to some extent. This is the only way that Theognis can rationalize what has happened, make sense of the good man's social position becoming reversed with that of the bad men, right? Because the nobility had, in abdicating their role as intercessors between man and God, in some sense now deserve it. But the fact that they had it in them to behave in a cowardly manner, in a dishonest manner, shows that they were not, noble in their soul. Or as Plato would later write, and we'll talk about Plato next week. He speaks of this is his famous noble lie, right? That in their ideal republic, they will teach the raised aristocratic class in that society to believe that they have true gold within themselves, within their own soul, right? Well, just to steal Plato's metaphor, Theognis is sort of perceiving that the nobility didn't have that true gold in their soul, that they had just as much of a, flawed, faulty sort of inner makeup as anyone else. And so anyway, he writes, quote, "None of the men on earth is born free of guilt. Of the men the sun looks down upon, there is no man entirely good and moderate," end quote. And so we can perceive a shift in Theognis near the end of his life, owing to the experiences that he lived through. The stark difference between the values he was born into and the situation of Megara by the time Theognis had lived to be an old man. Nietzsche writes, quote, "It It is quite possible that, once Theognis returned to his motherland, almost nearing the end of his life, he not only exercised more moderation in public affairs, but also distanced himself from some of his previous convictions about gods and men, and expressed himself a bit more liberally, above all concerning the dignity of plebeian man. He now exhorts Cyrnus not to reproach anyone for the opprobrium of poverty. Verses 155 through 158 reads, quote, "Therefore, even if it causes you displeasure, never reproach a man on account of his poverty, nor throw on him his wretched poverty. For truly, Zeus does tilt the scales either to one side or another, at one time to be rich, and at another to have nothing." End quote. Now, little to nothing is known about Theognis' death, but it seems rather obvious that he likely died of old age. As Nietzsche has it, he would have been around 90 years old after all. And so Nietzsche thus completes his sketch of the life of Theognis and the shifts in his perspective revealed in verses from various points in his life. Just to recap briefly, in his early days, Theognis writes of enjoying his youth while living a life of leisure. Here, as throughout his life, he wrote jovial drinking songs, and as well as poems of religious devotion to the gods, but overall his tone is happy and natural, except as the social unrest then begins to start, then he fears the pain he will endure in old age, once pushed into poverty. He grows up in a state of luxury that he was taught was the preserve of the aristocracy, and educated into the noble virtue ethic. But during the tyranny of Theognis, the prestige and standing of the aristocracy is irreparably damaged. Then comes the ochlocracy, in which Theognis initially attempted to flatter the popular party, but he nevertheless is known to be a lover of the oligarchs, and his property is taken from him anyway. He complains that like a stray dog, he must now drift from place to place and live in the most contemptible of circumstances. Poverty, which makes one's character just worse in every way. And then he returns years later, and the social structure has changed. Men who he sees as contemptible are now honored. Those who knew nothing of the sacred rites are now holding public office. Families with a religion intermarry with those who have none. And the justice of the gods no longer makes sense to him in the same way as a framework for understanding the various fates of mankind. Instead, it appears that the gods are fickle. Thus, we can look at one of the most famous or infamous verses of Theognis, which I remember it was one of the first ones I read by him. It encapsulates perfectly his aristocratic attitude and his reactionary stance against change and against the changes that took place within his very long life. But with everything we sort of looked at, I think this quotation will be very enlightening for everyone. This is verses 53 through 60. Quote, "Cyrnus, this city is certainly still a city, but its people are different. Those men who previously knew neither judgments nor laws, but wore goatskins on their sides and spread outside the city like deer, they are now the good, son of Polypeiades, and those formerly noble are now base. Can anyone endure this sight?" End quote. And so everything is turned upside down. Theognis believed in a set social hierarchy according to his religious convictions, and now it is inverted, and he believes this will lead to the death of the city. And, from his perspective, that would be inevitable because you have bad men, as we talked about, kakus people, cowardly men. They're now called good, and all the best people who might have saved the city are now denigrated and cast out. And so a question naturally arises here that I think many of you will have already been asking yourselves. Is Theognis not resentful? Is his hatred toward the common people, as Nietzsche described it, a rebellion against reality? Once upon a time, the social structure based on Theognis' moral values actually existed, but after that social reality dissolves, does Theognis' morality also become a condemnation of reality by that very reversal? And perhaps more to the point, let's consider the question just as a matter of psychological truth right? Or the psychological reality, regardless of how we want to philosophically understand the morality of Theognis. Is it simply a fact that Theognis' condemnation of society and his attacks on the changes that had happened are expressions of resentment? By being deprived of his power and finding himself disrespected and dishonored, in spite of the fact that he had once felt respect and honor owed to him as a very condition of his birth and inheritance, right? I mean, surely that's a textbook case as to how resentment is generated. Which is to say, when one has power imposed upon them, against which they are powerless, and they then go on to imagine a revenge against that source of power that they cannot oppose in physical space, right? And then they go on to condemn the real state of affairs which has been imposed upon them. They condemn it in a moral sense and say that should not have happened, right? And do we not see evidence of slave morality in the new moral valuations that Theognis comes to, i.e. the claim that all men are guilty, and that fortune is fickle, and that no man should be judged according to his station in life? I mean, all it took was being dispossessed of wealth and power, and suddenly Theognis sounds almost like a Christian, speaking of man's universal wickedness, and saying in so many words that the race does not always go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, right? So I think if you're asking these questions, you're very much onto something. And while I think Nietzsche might have argued, the noble culture war to reestablish the old hierarchies was more in keeping with the necessities of life and nature, and thus inherently less resentful than slave morality or so on and so forth, I can see the arguments you could make. But there's also, it must be said, an undertone of critique that Nietzsche has in his writings on Theognis, even in his dissertation, long before Nietzsche's theory concerning resentment was even formulated. He hints at it at the very end of the dissertation, where he writes the following paragraph, quote, "I believe that Theognis has taught me one thing. Since his life coincided with the transmutation of all things and opinions, it could not be possible for him to retain the same convictions with which he seemed to have been raised as a child. Hence, it is plain what Grote meant, that we should really agree that the Dorian vigor in its genuine nature was already in those days discernibly weakened and exhausted with Theognis." End quote. And so, as for the sentiment of Grote that Nietzsche references, Grote wrote, and I quote here in an abridged form, "Still less can we discover in the verses of Theognis that strength and peculiarity of pure Dorian feeling, which has been the fashion to look for so extensively." End quote. It's notable that Nietzsche concludes his dissertation with those words, because I think it reveals that he doesn't consider Theognis a paragon by any means. In fact, Theognis his life story is one of being sort of poisoned by his circumstances and changed by the social transformation along with everyone else. He is the aristocratic spirit, right? But already in like a weakened, dying, old form. And in this old age, he displays the effect that this has had on him. In Nietzsche's implicit criticism of Theognis at the end, we might perhaps see all the more the danger of resentment as a psychological poison. Theognis not only writes in his work contemptuously of how the nobility was transformed, but he himself, whether he was aware of this or not, is one among those nobles who was transformed and made into a decadent, we might say. And thus, if Nietzsche is to be compared to Theognis, then we must see some resemblance in Nietzsche's own admission that he himself was a decadent, but one who chose to rally his intellect to fight against decadence. That was the main difference between him and the others, right? And so we can see many parallels between the two men, that the correspondence between the democratic revolutions of the Greek polis and the French Revolution and the socialistic movements that followed in the 1800s, right, which were attacking the old religious convictions of Europe and threatened an old aristocratic order. Europe in Nietzsche's time now seemed inexorably speeding towards a course of democratization, and perhaps Nietzsche saw himself as occupying a similar place in history as Theognis. just as Theognis leaves behind an expression of the old noble morality in his verses to Cyrnus, attempting to raise a new generation to wage a cultural war against democracy, Nietzsche has the same goal with his own philosophy as he writes to the philosophers of the future. And yet we must conclude that at the end of his essay, Nietzsche displays an awareness of how Theognis himself had been degenerated by the events of his life. And I think he must have seen how those criticisms could have been applied to Nietzsche himself, should he choose to emulate Theognis. We haven't spent so much time discussing Nietzsche's main philological project that he undertakes in this dissertation, but I did mention it at the beginning, that Nietzsche sets out to disprove that these were gnomic poems. But we should mention that if you do read this dissertation, you'll see that Nietzsche spends a fair amount of time establishing that ancient authors considered Theognis as a gnomic poet, interpreting his project as a series of moral teachings, and even suggesting that maybe even Cyrnus was not a real person, but an imagined pupil meant to stand in for the audience. Without going into detail, in the interest of time, Nietzsche illustrates that, that the ancient scholars did write of Theognis this way, as an old moralist and a teacher of morals, and that in fact, today, if you go to the Wikipedia page, this opinion of Theognis is still on display in the opening paragraph, where the Wikipedia editors say that Theognis wrote gnomic poems. But Nietzsche demonstrates that, in fact, Theognis never collected his poems under the title of being moral instructions, and that they included many different types of poetry appropriate to different aspects of life, including, as we mentioned, convivial poems and drinking songs. Nietzsche writes, quote, Theognidean elegiac poetry was somehow born within these aristocratic circles. After guests are satisfied with food, they pour wine into their cups, offer a libation to the gods, and direct their prayers and songs especially to Apollo. This is followed by that part of the feast called komos, wholly devoted to musical performance and cheerful banter. Some table companions made it a practice to sing elegiac poems to the rhythm of the flute, among which almost all of the Theognidean elegies should be placed. It seems that Theognis, so to speak, selected the subjects of such poems, which could be classified in various and diverse classes, from common events of life, and especially from banquet scenes, as these were supposedly the best way they could stimulate the sensations and feelings of guests. And indeed, Theognis banters, either gently or with refinement, with his friends, as when he invites them to banquets and drinking parties. End quote. And from there, Nietzsche lists all the Theognidean poems, which are tributes or paeans to gods and goddesses, including verses dedicated to Apollo, to Diana, to the Muses and Graces, to Jupiter, to Castor and Pollux. Nietzsche then writes, further down in the essay, that contests occurred between table companions. That's the famous touchstone or test of the symposia, the competition between the good men of the city in their attempts to outdo one another in conversation or in riddles or in singing, or whatever the case may be. Nietzsche says the genre of table songs and riddles was, quote, very common at banquets, which is also documented in Theognis in the following verses. Quote, the most beautiful is most just, and best is health, and the most pleasant thing is to obtain what you love. End quote. In addition to these, we find poems in which Theognis charmingly recommends the use of wine and praises the enjoyment of one's youth as a worthy thing, and that when one is young, it's right and good they should pursue the youthful passions such as sexual encounters, adventure, pleasures of the flesh, physical competition, and so on. In some lines, he recounts his romance with a girl of high birth whose parents wished her to pursue a rich plebeian, but she liked Theognis in spite of the fact that he was poor during this time in his life. He writes, quote, there, embracing the girl with my arms, I kissed her neck, and a soft whisper came out of her lips. End quote. And so what we find in Theognis' canon of work is really, it's like an expression of the feelings at all seasons of one's life, right? These are poems of a man of feeling. And that's how Nietzsche thought of the aristocrats of ancient Greece. And that conception is probably influenced a great deal by this study of Theognis here. But importantly, though, it's difficult to see how many of these poems that we find in his canon could be classified as gnomic or as morally instructive, the way some of the verses addressed to Cyrnus may seem to be to modern ears. The reason I wanted to return to this point is that it illustrates the gulf Nietzsche saw between the aristocratic sensibilities and the post-Socratic view of life, which we are more sympathetic to within the Alexandrian age that we're all living in. That this is not a moralistic expression or an attempt to impart some universal ethos for human behavior. This is the work of a passionate, expressive man of a certain time and place. It's Theognis' confession, his laying bare of his inner states. And not all of them are laudable or morally praiseworthy or reflect even Theognis himself in the best light, right? This is coming from a man of a social class that pre-Socrates still lived in that world of myth and ritual, and with their prejudices unexamined, right? The class who maintained the libations and the funereal repasts and paid respect to the gods, but also saw no impiety in writing poems about the joy of lovemaking and drinking. Nietzsche writes also, quote, "I know of no ancient poet to have written more subtly on the influence of music," end quote. So Theognis understands the power of music, or of poetry at that time, which was an inherently musical thing, and the power that music has over the affects, the passions. And yet, unlike Socrates or Plato, he doesn't oppose poetry for this danger, but he practices it himself. And so the Theognis that we get in popular scholarship, according to Nietzsche, is a sort of a warped figure, a distortion that doesn't allow us to see the true perspective of Theognis because it's colored by our modern Alexandrian morality, or more broadly speaking, by our slave moralistic perspective. For some concluding thoughts, let's look now at this fragment I mentioned before called The Studies on Theognis, where Nietzsche draws out some of the philosophical implications of the work that he did in his dissertation. He effectively summarizes the insights he gleaned while doing his research on Theognis of Megara. Nietzsche writes in this fragment, quote, "One should establish that these poems, as outpourings of the soul, were not of an exclusive nature. They were representations of an agitated inner life, written in times of distress, of political turmoil, of seafaring, of wandering around, of homecoming, of love and friendship. They were never written with the single-sided aim to teach, but to relieve the soul. Among them one finds pure moral scholia, but no elegies, a difference that one should not exclude from consideration. Then there are such songs as those generally brought out by a symposium, drinking songs, appeals to the gods, and so on. The old aristocracy could not maintain itself beyond the Persian wars, the transfer of wealth unto men of the people, and the universal spreading of knowledge and art ruined a nobility of blood. With this, Theognis' elegies lost the needed context which would have allowed them to be understood. The commoners approached them with different conceptions. One would now find ethical principles, when before one would find everything noble. References to sympathetic communities were no longer understood. Theognis himself was no longer known." End quote. So I think that's a wonderful summary of, first, what these poems actually are, which is a reflection of the agitated inner life of a passionate man who endured hardship and saw his moral values overturned and destroyed. And second, why that the incorrect interpretation of the poems prevailed, right? Because the needed context for understanding the poems was lost. The only thing that could be understood by the Alexandrian culture that inherited Theognis' work was as a moral teaching, as we've mentioned. And so Nietzsche in this fragment goes on to explain how, as successive generations took Theognis simply as a teacher of morality in the form of, gnomic poetry, his broader canon fell out of favor. Why? Well, because Theognis became taught in school books of the ancient world. And school books are always eventually degraded in their value, because who wants to return to reading the books of instruction they were forced to read in school? As the ancient writer Isocrates writes, Theognis is highly reputed, but is read reluctantly, because human beings dislike receiving advice. Nietzsche cites this assessment of Theognis' importance among the peoples of antiquity as being highly explanatory. Theognis was thus exploited. Nietzsche writes, quote, "The Socratic school use of the book sealed it as a school book. The gnomes were extracted and the children had to learn them by heart. This is not reported specifically with regard to Theognis, but is surely to be inferred from a text by Aeschines contra Seistophantem. Quote, I know that we as children learned the gnomes of the poet by heart, so that we could use them as grown-up men." End quote. That Theognis was among the first to have this fate allows us well to suspect his pedagogical exploitability. This fact has two different consequences. One, the whole elegies gradually disappeared, and the excerpts, at first many-sided and numerous, became ultimately consistent. And two, the aversion toward Theognis on the part of the public increased, as indeed schoolbooks in general are frequently and undeservedly destined to decline in appreciation. End quote. And so, in the final paragraph of this essay, Nietzsche ties together all the many threads of analysis we've sort of examined considering Theognis' life and work, and the Nietzschean interpretation thereof. Quote, "This is how Theognis reached completion, and is how we have him today. Theognis appears as a sophisticated and run-down grand feudal lord, or Junker, with feudal passions, loved in his own epoch, full of mortal hatred against an aspiring people, tossed about by a sad fate that grinded him down and made him milder in many ways. He comes into view as a characterization of that bright, somewhat corrupted, and no longer firmly established nobility of blood at the crossing between an ancient and a new time. A contorted Janus head, because for him the past appeared so beautiful and enviable, set against a future in and for itself of equal entitlements, loathsome and repugnant. Theognis appears as a characteristic mind of all those noble figures that represent an aristocracy on the eve of a popular revolution that threatens their privileges forever and makes them fight and wrestle with the same passion for their own caste and their own existence." End quote. And so there we have it. That's the story of Theognis of Megara and of Nietzsche's scholarship on him. He is a self-contained tale of a revaluation of values, as it happened in the ancient world. He's a microcosmic representation within one individual of what happened in Greek society. He stood at the crossroads looking in both directions. Like the two-faced god, Janus, his gaze turned both with horror to the future, which seems inevitable, and with a longing to the beautiful past, which was fading. And there's a sort of double entendre to talk about him with the contorted Janus head, because Nietzsche talks about how he became outwardly milder in many ways, often advising Cyrnus not to outwardly express hatred or enmity with the bad men, the plebeians, who were now becoming rich and influential. And yet, the hatred he nursed within him became more and more intense. His determination to wage a culture war against democracy, the thing that had brought down his old social system based on his own moral values, that became more intense. So he has this mortal hatred written on his inner face, so to speak, but his external expression is one of mildness. And Nietzsche, therefore, seems to understand the bitterness within Theognis, and his hatred of all the cowardly and dissolute among the ranks of the nobility, that perhaps we can say Theognis was resentful and began to entertain beliefs of the moral guilt of all to explain the downfall of his beloved social order. For he is himself changed by the revolution that has taken place. And so we can see where both the ideas of Theognis, which are found in his poetic verses, and the story of his life serve Nietzsche and direct his future project. In Theognis' life, Nietzsche sees a man devout to his principles even against all practical considerations, and unable to fully or effectively become an untrue person who betrays those principles. But he's a poet rather than a philosopher. He's a man who lays bare his passions to the world and desires to subtly use those passions to stir things in others in order to fight this cultural war. In Theognis' ideas, on the other hand, Nietzsche perceives this notion of an innate and implicit division between men, between noble and common, between the good men and the bad men. And finally, as a representation of the Dorian ethos, Theognis shows us the Apollonian, revealed many years before Nietzsche's formal examination of this idea in Birth of Tragedy. The art of the nobility as the shining, beautiful representation or image of this life, right? Apollo, the dream god and soothsayer god, imbues us with this religious reverence for the divine, and as archer god aims from a distance, shows us the contemplative, sober mind, one that is kept apart from and above the masses, the common people, right? And so, in short, while one may find the same aristocratic sentiments of the ancient Hellenes represented in some form or another in Homer or Thucydides or Sophocles, they're revealed with the greatest clarity in sheer stark relief in Theognis. When Nietzsche is speaking of the aristocratic temperament, he's speaking of the early Theognis. When he writes of the Apollonian pathos of distance, he finds it also in Theognis. The Greek notions of good and bad that form up the basis of the master morality, it's right here in Theognis. And even the psychological force of resentment, which changes and indeed worsens even the noblest soul, as Nietzsche would later argue. That too is revealed here in the story of Theognis. That's all for this week. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.